So thank you very much for inviting me. This is not the classroom setting that I had originally envisioned, but I hope that this will convey, at least I will convey in some sort of fashion, my own energy and excitement about this topic, although excitement is perhaps too extreme a word. So let me begin. Natural right and historical mindedness begins rather abruptly. Quote, "The notion of collective responsibility is not without its difficulties," close quote. Community then is assumed as humankind's self-realization in the concrete in history. At the same time, this certainly pushes against any common sense understanding of community, locating it in a common or shared field of experience, understanding, judgment, and consent, which in turn forms, quote, "the possibility, the source, the ground of common meaning." Lonergan goes on to problematize the obvious. If collective responsibility, he writes, is not yet an established fact, it may be a possibility. Further, it may be a possibility that we can realize. Finally, it may be a possibility that is desirable to realize, close quote. The very possibility of such self-realization brings concretely to the fore, I'm quoting here now, interpersonal living and working with others, and the recognition of excellence, the vital value of health and strength, the communal value of a successfully functioning social order, the cultural value proclaimed as life to be sustained, not by bread alone, but also by the word, the personal appropriation of these values by individuals, their historical extension in progress, deviation from them in decline, and their recovery by self-sacrificing love. Natural right and historical mindedness regards the realization, or not, of human good and its correlation to the practically intelligent exercise of individual and collective responsibility. And collective responsibility depends upon much that could be otherwise. It is this otherwise, this being positioned within a cultural matrix, rooted and grounded in a racial project, that is the topic of questions for theology as political or political theology. The illustrations I will give are sad and sadly illustrative. On the evening of June 17, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof walked into Charleston, South Carolina's historic Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was invited to join and to participate in the prayer and Bible study that was in progress. After some time, Roof took out a handgun and fatally shot 9 women and men and injured another. Identified by several people in the vicinity, Roof was arrested the morning after the shooting. He later confessed that this shooting, this hate crime, was his attempt to ignite a race war between blacks and whites, to purge his community of so-called impure and corrupting elements. This hate crime followed in the wake of the deaths of Andy Lopez in Santa Rosa, California, Eric Garner in Staten Island, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Maryland, Sandra Bland in Waller County, Texas, Ayanna Stanley Jones in Detroit, and Raika Boyd in Chicago, either directly at the hands of police or under suspicious circumstances while in police custody or police tactical responses. The troubling circumstances of all these deaths, along with the increased privatization and growth of the prison industrial complex, massive rates of incarceration, particularly for black and brown men, criminalization of poverty, vicious responses to migrant, refugee, homeless, mentally ill, abused, differently abled, and poor white and dark children, women, and men expose the difficulty of creating community of taking up authentic responsibility for healing our culture, for realizing human and humane life in U.S. society. These incidents provoke and incite shock, even demand outrage. They coalesce as concrete data for theology's critical reflection on the vicious way in which racism corrupts and distorts culture, that is, the meanings and values that inform our way of life. The way in which racism interrupts and damages human living and human persons. In the preface of Insight, Lonergan poses this poignant and compelling question. How is a mind to become conscious of its own bias when that bias springs from a communal flight from understanding and is supported by the whole texture of a civilization? This question directs us to the root of racialized and racist actions or behavior, reminding us that racism is not something already out there now, but rather it is woven into the fabric of our consciousness, our intersubjective spontaneity, our thinking, our decisions, our habits, and our actions. Crudely put, racism is not out there, it is in us, all of us. We have been taught to think and act in racialized and racist ways, and we do so. Lonergan's poignant and compelling question and the decisive connection between understanding and responsibility, that is, acting in a practically intelligent manner, motivates my theological responses to the self-contradictory yet remarkable, intractable yet astonishing social order that we in the United States have constructed. Obviously, these responses could take up a range of further questions regarding education, social and religious formation, psychic development, bias, conversion, and so on. But for the remainder of this presentation, I want to take up and think with you about meaning and memory. So I look forward really to our conversation and our engagement, and I certainly hope the Skype works. So common meaning and common memory. All memory, Maurice Halbwachs maintains, are communal. Individuals do not remember alone, but rather as members of a group. It is within families, friendships and associations, within communities, within societies, that people normally acquire their memories, and here too women and men recall, recognize, and localize their own personal memories. Common or shared memory requires and grounds community. And while shared geography may be important, it is not, as we know, the formal determinant of community. Common meaning is. Community is achievement of common meaning. Common meaning entails shared or analogous, even plural experience, common and complementary understanding, judgment, decision, and action. Common meaning is realized in communal choices and decisions, in embrace of common values, goals, policies, commitments, and loves. Community coheres or divides, begins or ends, Lonergan tells us, just where the common field of experience, common understanding, common judgment, common commitments begin and end. Because a world of different and differentiated experiences and their meanings ranges well beyond any individual's immediate or personal experience, a community or nation cultivates common memory, sifting, collating, and making available differing and differentiated experiences, expressions, products, and memories of individual and collective understanding, judgment, and action. Common memory conserves and communicates a common past, nurtures a common present, and fashions a common future. Yet achievement, preservation, and transmission of common memory are neither simple nor simplistic. In this endeavor, historical memory and critical history are indispensable. What does it mean to remember? To remember collective or group or social trauma. In recent decades, we have come to understand memory of traumatic experience, particularly collective or group experience, such as slavery or genocide, internment, ethnic cleansing, feminicide, disappearance, mass atrocities as a political act. Mari Ruti argues, quote, an excess of memory may be paralyzing, impeding the emergence of new modalities of life, of new passions, possibilities, and preoccupations. What does it mean to remember? To remember collective or group wrongdoing, public acts of grieving, official apologies, reparations, as well as commemorative efforts through museums, monuments, and artistic interventions remain morally and ethically necessary. And although repression of facts of wrongdoing and violent events may provoke imitation in subsequent generations, immersion in or fascination with narratives of victimization could lead to repetition of those acts or corrosive bitterness or self-wounding. A nation that remembers wrongs it has committed against groups or subjugated peoples risks responsibility. For a nation to risk collective taking responsibility for past wrongs is a daunting task and cannot be undertaken grudgingly or under threat or half-heartedly. While collective taking responsibility for past wrongs cannot undo the harm or minimize the gravity, but undertaking such actions, Jeffrey Bluestein insists, does affect, quote, a retroactive change in the significance of the past wrongdoing, close quote. The wrongdoing now is invested with different meaning, he writes, quote, because it is acknowledged as wrong and responsibility is taken for it, close quote. To quote Bluestein again, by accepting the burden of making amends, the responsible group demonstrates its willingness to accept some pain and humiliation for the sake of the victims, and in so doing, symbolically asserts what was previously denied, namely the moral standing of the victims, close quote. Collective taking responsibility for collective wrongs ought to involve three interrelated and societally significant imperatives: the cognitive, affective, and moral. The cognitive demand seeks much more than some vague awareness of past wrong, but rather sympathetic inquiry, learning, questioning, and understanding. Certainly this requires an apprenticeship to history as a guide in discerning and telling the truth about certain events and people in the past. The affective calls for engagement with and reorientation of emotion, for historical explanation alone cannot overcome fear or alienation or shame at wrongdoing or at having been wronged. Through interpersonal conversation, structured group dialogues, and heightened attention to intersubjectivity, hearts may be opened and changed. The moral imperative moves a nation's people to action. Collective taking responsibility involves moral encounter with festering wounds and foreclosed grievances, neither to appease a wronged group, nor simply mourn those wrongs and render them static, but rather to militate on behalf of them. To risk responsibility is to risk action for change. Merely calling to mind evil committed will not remedy evil that has been done. The second aspect I'd like to explore briefly is the cost of forgetting. After the collapse of destructive and violent regimes, Germany, Spain, Chile, Argentina, and South Africa needed to take up some explicit position with regard to that past. The Germans deployed the term Vergangenheitsbewältigung to name efforts to deal publicly with the Nazi past. Publications of personal testimonies about experiences of torture and oppression carried out under these totalitarian regimes have given rise to a notion of an ethics of memory. Although forgetting may not necessarily be unethical, forgetting forced upon human beings against their will or interest most certainly is. So let's consider two types of coerced forgetting: repressive erasure and structural amnesia. States or governments or ruling parties utilize repressive erasure to deny historical events or facts, crucial ruptures or breaks. So consider the Turkish denial and dismissal of the Armenian charge of genocide. This is one example of this type of forgetting. At this point in the United States, we've made a movie now entitled The Promise, which deals with the Armenian genocide. I'm sure it will reach Australia at some point. The lack of an apology from the United States federal government to the indigenous people for expropriation of land and violation of treaties presents another. Repressive erasure also may be covert. Through spatial scripting and editing, curators of museums and galleries, designers and architects of public spaces established iconographic programs that highlight what is or is not of political and aesthetic significance. In exhibiting a master narrative, the museum's spatial script is overt in its acts of celebratory remembrance, covert in acts of editing out and erasure. John Barnes employed the phrase structural amnesia in his genealogical studies to explain the suppression of suspect matrilineal lines in mapping the British peerage. But it resonates with the notion of structural embarrassment. This term, coined by historian of religions Charles Long, constitutes one way to describe the relationship of the descendants of the enslaved Africans to the U.S. population at large. How, we might wonder, is a courageous and thoughtful, yet fractious and slave-holding group of men and women who, inspired by European Enlightenment ideals, revolted from a tyrannical, colonizing power in order to gain political and economic freedom, committed their lives in sacred honor to uphold certain inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to pass on through history to their political descendants these values despite the subjugation of a people, despite the legalization of black unfreedom. How is a nation so conceived and so dedicated to equality to acknowledge and to confess a history of slaveholding on its own territory? Its people turn away from the offending knowledge, gloss over and fudge historical fact, conceal and hide from the very truths they seek to conceal. Historians tell us that slavery is the tough stuff of American history, and it is. We conspire to forget, we repress or edit, we delete our knowledge. Scholarly and popular interest in slavery is of recent vintage and dates from the last years of the 20th century and the initial years of this 21st. Americans are neither exceptional nor alone in the effort to repress national exploitation, violence, and evil. William Stanner coined the term the Great Australian Silence to critique the persistent refusals of the Australian government to apologize to the Aboriginal people for a century of forcible removal of their children from their families. Certainly we know that on February 12, 2008, the Australian Parliament issued a formal apology to the Aboriginal people. And on the following day, in a formal public ceremony, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologized. Repressive erasure does not mean that individual members of a dominant culture or group lack remorse or do not feel the wrench of conscience when contemplating the damage and destruction done to indigenous people or descendants of enslaved or marginalized or minoritized peoples. Rather, this form of forgetting progressively and systematically erases the achievements and contributions, the experiences of these groups from common and national memory. What does a community, a nation, forfeit when it repressively erases memory of the very presence and condition of those whom they have dishonored, when it overlooks and humiliates these groups into silence and invisibility? Remembering is terrifying, especially when the perpetrators of wrong are no longer available, when death or decades disrupt the possibility of apology or direct reparations to survivors. How does a nation restore to a subjugated people their languages and ceremonies, their lands and cultures, their hopes and dreams? No reparations can suffice. But one of our great writers, James Baldwin, contends, quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Traumatic wrongs like genocide and slavery wield a body blow to social life and damages the bonds linking people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. By forgetting its past, a nation relinquishes social integrity as well as authentic moral integrity and authority. And by forgetting its past, a nation risks its unity or cohesion, its very moral existence. These are the topics of theology as political theology in this context. Thank you.